weeks ago, we had a visitor show up on our porch late at night, meowing like crazy, and I had compassion for it, and we've gave it a little bit of food. Since then, we've seen her show up, come and go as she pleases, and give us the most affection that I've ever seen a cat give in my entire life. So we've set out a little bowl of food and water for her, so anytime she wants to come and pay us a visit, she can. Whether she's a stray, we aren't really sure, but she's sure sweet and affectionate, and we love having her. She's also super helpful with hunting down mice and grasshoppers. We've seen her come and pay a visit and then wander off and pounce on something in the yard. So we're super blessed to call this kitty our friend and hope she sticks around for a little while longer. As far as our other animals on the farm, the rabbits are growing healthy and strong. We bring them out on a regular basis to give them some time to kick their legs, run around, roll around, play in the dirt, and have a good time. So now that you've met our little farm kitty, we are shifting gears over to the progress of our herb garden. So this was several months ago, earlier in the summer, when we set up our herb garden. It was very low key. We just got some leftover stone that was used for our home, and then we dumped some compost here, spread it out, and got to planting. So I had started some seeds indoors while we were still living in our rental that I knew I wanted to plant in our herb garden, and I've always wanted an herb garden. So here's some of those seeds in the soil blocks. So once we got the space prepared, and I kind of wish I would have layered on a little bit more compost, but we'll add that later. And so we got to organizing. At first, I thought I would want to have different sections for the herb garden, like this is the basil section, the dill, the cilantro. But after a while, I realized I think I just would rather have this kind of a chaos mixed garden, and I can kind of identify the herbs. So we got them all planted, and this is what they looked like, just so tiny at the very beginning. Now it is fall. We are coming up on below 20 degrees this weekend, and I know I'm going to lose some of these plants, and the ground's going to get a little bit harder to work with. So there is some care that needs to happen with this herb garden. I'm actually super, super pleased with all that's happened. I actually also planted some lettuce and some kale in this garden so that we could easily access that for lunch sandwiches or for dinner salads. And these are some lettuce plants that have gone to seed, and I'm trying to decide if I'm going to let them reseed themselves right here or pull them and replant next year. And I decided to leave those lettuce, but there's these lettuce plants that are going to seed, but they're super close to the parsley that I have. You can see that to the right of the lettuce. And I kind of want to give the parsley more of its own space. So I took a little extra time this week to weed out this area. Anywhere we have fertile soil and watering happening, we get tons of alfalfa growing in our gardens. We live right next to an alfalfa field, so it just blows over. And so I removed all those alfalfa plants. Now that we're going to be dipping into below 20 degrees, in fact, I think one night's supposed to get down to 15 degrees. A lot of these plants are going to be pretty sad, though they do stay a little bit warmer right up next to our house. So we'll see what happens. But I want to get a jump start on my indoor herb garden this year. So I had an indoor herb garden last year, and it was really nice to have fresh herbs, basil, parsley, thyme, just right from my windowsill in the middle of winter. In fact, there'd be days that it would be dumping 2 feet of snow on the ground, and I had the smell of fresh basil in my kitchen, and I loved it. So I am taking out a few plants from this herb garden so that I can have them in my indoor herb garden for the winter. And this is actually a rosemary plant, which will not survive our winters here. If you go when a couple zones warmer, it would, but it will not overwinter here. So my plan is just to dig it up, put it in a pot, and add it to my indoor herb garden. So where is my indoor herb garden? Well, we have these two really great south-facing windows right in the dining area. And so that's where I'm putting them right now, and they'll probably stay there all winter. But I won't have them looking like this. So I just have thrown this together with random pots I had in the garage and bowls from the kitchen to catch some of the water that drains below. I have a couple mint plants, some oregano plants that are on the next window over. But I will probably try to get some pots all match or uniform so that it looks nice over in this area. But here's to the start of our winter herb garden. Now, switching gears again, it is time to make dinner, and I want to show you one of my favorite simple, easy meals. So we like to keep dishes at a minimum whenever possible. But we also like to cook from scratch. And if you ever do both of those two things, it almost doesn't work. Cooking from scratch tends to bring in a lot of dishes. So I'll show you something that I love doing that only is kind of like a one pot meal in the Instant Pot. But first, my Instant Pot has bone broth that had been cooking overnight. And so I've got to get that broth out, and I will actually use some of it for our meal tonight. I usually cook a whole chicken either once a week or every other week and just add to my bone broth stores, which are actually getting kind of low because I've been cooking more soups and stews now that it's been getting colder. So I'm adding these, and I've just been freezing mine. I could pan them, but I'm finding that I'm using them fast enough that they're not taking up too much space in my freezer. So I did have a little bit extra, and this is what I will be using in my meal tonight. I love adding bone broth to pretty much anything I can because of how nutritious it is. I just love adding that to the meals. So we've got our pot, we've got our fresh herbs, we've got our onion from the garden, and our homemade bone broth. And so what I like to do is this is just a simple pasta spaghetti recipe, and anytime I make that, I love to just really bring up the flavor with sauteing onions, sauteing garlic, and sauteing fresh herbs before adding the sauce. So sometimes I will make the sauce, but right now in this season of life, we are not at that point. So I just feel like store-bought sauce is kind of bland and just not that fun. And especially with this recipe, you do add a little bit of water to cook into the Instant Pot. So saute those onions, saute the garlic, add the herbs, and then cook that with your meat of choice. And I just use a ground meat here for this because of how easy it is. I usually add between a cup of water to 2 cups of water, depending on how many pasta noodles I add. Add the sauce, dump in your noodles, and the goal is to have liquid covering your noodles. Set that for 10 minutes and quick release. So don't let it release. I accidentally let this cook too long, and so that's why some of the noodles are overcooked. But that's it. One pot pasta meal, super nutritious, and only one pot got dirty. So that's definitely a family favorite at our house. Okay, our next project is the onions. You saw me harvest these onions several weeks ago, and I've just been letting them cure and dry out here in our very, very unorganized garage. And yes, organizing our garage is a project for the someday, but right now, homestead projects and irrigation projects have really taken over our lives. But this needed to happen. And at first, I had the hopes and dreams of braiding these onions and started to go sort through them in my wagon here. And I didn't want to do this in the garage because of how messy onions are. The skins fall off everywhere and things just. The unfortunate thing is that I was doing this on a super windy day and the skins were just blowing everywhere. Our little farm kitty, who the kids have affectionately named River, decided to come over and hang out with me while I organized onions, which was really nice. So that wasn't working, having the onions just sitting in the wheelbarrow. So I decided to separate them from red onions to yellow onions and also separate them with the ones that had a longer stem for braiding versus the ones that were shorter. And I put the short ones in the box. But I was finding that most of the little stems from these onions were pretty short and very, very brittle. And I don't know if that's because I let them cure too long or what, but I was just trying to save the ones that had the longest because I knew I needed a longer stem for the braiding. So I took some time to organize, and as I was doing this, I just had this fear that a black widow would get on my hands, but there wasn't one. But we have seen several crawling around these onions, so it was just kind of playing with fire on that one. So here's my box of short stemmed onions, and then here's our long stem red onions and yellow onions. And here is me attempting to braid them, and oh my goodness, they just were falling apart. And I've braided onions before and in previous years of gardening, and this did not happen. So I don't know if I let them dry for too long and they got super brittle, so brittle that it was falling apart. There was no way. So, or if it was just this year my onions weren't as robust with the stems that they needed for braiding. So the braid wasn't going to happen this year, and so I was a little sad about that because I just think those are so fun and pretty to have. But next year, you guys, that's okay. So we ended up just cutting off the stems a little bit, a couple inches off of the onion, and putting them into the box. There is something magical surrounding a harvest from the garden. It always seems to draw in a few kids who desperately want to be involved, and I love it. These kids have responsibilities around the house and the homestead, but I don't make them join me in every project. I want to protect their childhood and allow lots of time for them to satisfy their curiosities or to create. So we don't make them work all day, but as I mentioned before, the garden has a way of inviting that curiosity and desire to work. And if I'm being 100% honest, one of the biggest reasons I garden isn't to become more self-sufficient. It is to give my kids the opportunity to learn and grow through the seasons of what the garden provides.